In a world filled with conflict, in a universe comprised of differences, there's one thing that absolutely everything shares in common. We all exist. Including two guys named Jack and Michael, who like to chat about that very thing over a good cup of coffee. Let's pay them a visit, shall we?
Existence Brewing.
So I think I'll have a kombucha this time. Yep. One kombucha.
That stuff's spoiled.
Yeah. Yeah, just don't look at the bottom.
It's bad.
Don't look at the bottom of the bottle. You don't know what that...
I'm pretty sure this drink is spoiled. We need to take it back.
Yeah.
I'd like to replace it with something that's not quite as fermented.
Oh, yes, of course. It's like the time I was in college and I ordered the ahi tuna. And I cut into it and I said, this is like raw.
You cut into it and said, ahi.
And the waiter's like, yeah, that's traditionally how it's prepared. But
seared on both sides.
We will take it back and cook it for you if you want. I said, no, I'm sorry.
I had the same experience. It was a really good restaurant on the Oregon coast, and I ordered the seared ahi tuna, not realizing that it would be seared and black sesame encrusted, actually, but not realizing that it would essentially be sushi for 9/10 of the... But I ate it, and it was quite good, and my fear of raw fish died some years ago. I think my ex-wife she got into sushi, and then it was the push, and I was just like, no, there's something about raw fish. Because I, may as well be from Idaho, this white kid who's just... But then finally one day, somebody put a piece of sushi in my mouth, and I was like, oh, damn. This is like hella on from now on. It's one of my favorite foods. And so,
that's cool.
Yeah, my girlfriend and I eat sushi quite a bit. She's on a sushi kick galore right now, ramen also. And we don't have a good ramen place here in our hometown. We've got a couple sushi places that work just fine, but no real honest-to-God ramen that's good. But, man, a good bowl of ramen, there's nothing like that.
What about pho? Do you like pho?
She's the pho fan. I am actually into the bún bowls. But, yes, we love Vietnamese food, too. But I'm more the bún bowl guy. I like the salad with the crunchy egg roll and the seared chicken and all that stuff on the top. And she likes pho is good, but I never wind up getting it because I just like the bún bowls so much better. So
maybe we should meet there sometime, and we could do the episode at the pho place.
Yeah, except that guy knows me from a long time ago.
Oh, really?
And he'll come over and be like, why'd you sell your house? And it's just like, that was like 9 years ago now or something. I don't really feel like I owe you an explanation.
What's wrong with the house? Did he buy your house? How does he know you? I have a
feeling it's just like he's striking up conversation, just trying to make conversation. But, there are those people that, like I just finished working with one who used to frustrate the hell out of me. He didn't know how to strike up a conversation. And so his idea of doing that was basically to state the obvious. Like, I would bring a peanut butter sandwich to work in the morning and sit and eat it, and he would just literally go, is that a sandwich? And I'd be like, what the fuck do you think it is, man? I mean, like...
What are you, from some foreign country? A sandwich.
Didn't mean to be an ass, but it's like, okay, let's just stop right here. This is not the way you open a conversation with a grown, person. This is... I'm not 6 years old. Is that a sandwich? I mean, it's like, no. It's back up. Hey, what kind of sandwich, Jack? There you go. Now we're on to something. And then I can be like, it's a peanut butter, but... And then, oh, really? Do you like crunchy or smooth? Okay, now we're vibing. Now we're starting to go somewhere. Now it's like we're on a date, and I'm trying to actually score with you. Isn't that what most conversations are constituted of? Be it they're just passing between, two people at work, coworkers, or whatever. It doesn't even have to be for those purposes. But
yes.
It is. It's almost like all small talk is designed to eventually get you laid. But but that skill, I guess you could call it a skill, is used in like different settings. So anyway, and then I'll have my girlfriend with me and he'll just be like, "You're not married anymore." And it's just like, "Oh God, no.
Why you pick this one?
This your daughter?" And I'm like, "No, actually it's not."
So was he a neighbor or what was the...
No, he was just, what he was kind of a fan. He knew that I worked in radio and he sort of listened and in an ancillary way, kind of in the in crowd, like, "Oh, I know this guy. He comes to my restaurant." So I think the Thai place would be a better fit.
Is this your daughter?
Well, again, my girlfriend is half my age, so
you always like to bring that up, don't you?
Well, it's a paramount feature in my life right now. It is not some place that I had ever pictured myself being. My father married someone like more than half his age when he was about my age, actually. But he was a whole different guy than I am. Yeah. Like, I eschewed this potential relationship for almost a year thinking, no, this tradition should, I don't know what I was, but then all of a sudden it's just like, what's the problem? You got no other leads, Jack. You may as well. I mean, and she's great. She's wonderful. We're best of friends. I've learned more from her in a year and a half than I learned from all of my other relationships in 28 years, including a 22-year marriage. She's taught me more about myself and about life and the world, and sometimes you have to be ready for that. So I think
that's really cool.
It's just situational. It's circumstantial. I had to be 49 when we began seeing each other, and she was 23.
Wow.
So,
well, I'm happy for you.
Well, thanks. I'm
happy for both of you.
I'm sorry we can't go get pho and record the show there because
you just blew
but that's
that out
not
of
really
the water.
the fault of the relationship. But maybe some people think I'm evil. It's funny. Speaking of evil, her obsession with serial killers continues. Like, I just came off John Wayne Gacy week about a month ago, and then right after that we had Ted Bundy week, and I can only, like, I'm as fascinated as anybody is, I suppose, with how someone gets that way. And I guess I do have a morbid enough curiosity that I'm interested in a little bit of the non-gory details, but some of the, actual, I don't want that stuff in my brain.
It's a thing, though. You're right. It's a total thing. And I think that, you touched on celebrity, and I kind of feel like that's an element of it, is people are almost treating them like they're the Kardashians or something. And it's like, no, the man ate children.
Yeah, so we just finished the 72-hour Richard Ramirez marathon, which was mostly constituted of this documentary special. And you know how they are with docs now on Netflix. Nothing can ever just be an hour long and be done with. That's the old PBS days. Now everything is a Ken Burns series. And so it's 4 or 5 episodes long. And really the stars of the show are the detectives that ran him down, that finally were put on the case. And because it's really a Hollywood script writing itself. They were two very polar opposites. One guy was very young, brand new to the task force that was assigned to track down Ramirez, and he was the Night Stalker. So find out who this Night Stalker character was. And the other guy was a celebrity in the world of detectives. He'd busted the Hillside Strangler and was well known. I mean, they really revered him, all the people that talked about him. So they were an unlikely Felix and Oscar couple hunting down the Night Stalker, which they did. So they really stole the show, which was great because it was really more premised on the detectives than it was Ramirez and all of his sick, sadistic, disgusting murders and lots of, like, and I didn't know too much about the guy, I got to be honest. I'd sort of maybe stayed purposefully ignorant to most of the whole thing. I knew who he was and that he'd obviously randomly killed some people back in the 80s and all that. But I guess it was nice to catch up 45 years later or whatever it is, 40 years later on what happened when I was in junior high school, because that's when that all went down. I'm not sure that I buy evil. I don't buy the yin and yang thing, let's put it that way. But I don't think the universe or God has anything to do with that. So I don't believe in a totality that has been created with this whole idea of the swirl, where one side of the swirl ice cream cone is white and one side is black, and each side has a little donut hole in it that's the opposite color. I don't believe in yin and yang. in the sense of good and evil. And, you know, an example of that to me that sticks out that I was thinking of is a lot of times we use that as a contrasting agent for good. And that's kind of where the whole theory begins is, well, it's almost like a guilt complex, I feel like some kind of a universal guilt complex for feeling good. And yet feeling good, why not? I mean, we're here, so why not feel as good as you possibly can? You're going to go through some tough days no matter how, whatever you are, no matter how much money you have or how beautiful you are, all these things that we desire so much. You can be all those things and still have terrible days, even look back and say I had a pretty terrible life for whatever reason, probably because you may have helped in making it that way. But anyway, it kind of boiled down to, I don't think that we need to use evil, the conception of evil, as a contrasting agent to feel good about good. Like, for example, you know, who would ever says that, gosh, I'm sure glad Hitler was a thing because it makes me feel better about ice cream even more than I already do. I mean, nobody says that, right? Mm-hmm. Why would we look at something that's already inherently good? And even though ice cream is not that good for you, it is sweet and tasty and delicious and comes in a million flavors. And I mean, I've never met anybody who doesn't like ice cream, quite frankly. So why then would we need to put Richard Ramirez and say, well, I'm sure glad the Night Stalker came along because, boy, you know, that Tin Roof Sundae is really popping now. I feel a lot better about this. No one does that, so why do we do that? Why is it then that we use it as a general contrast, agent of contrast for good, for this idea, this notion that this is a good deed or, you know, I'm a good person, and yet we have to somehow invite this dark shadow that fills 50% of the equation to say, well, now let's make it stand out. Why? I don't like that idea personally.
And I think it almost speaks to people's desire to really focus on the negative things that happen in people's lives. Like over the weekend, I was watching a documentary on the late actress Brittany Murphy. And
tragic ending there.
Oh, man. Have you seen that documentary?
I have not seen the doc. I do know about what happened to her, though.
Highly recommend watching that. It was an interesting show, and she really was just kind of taken by this. Her life was taken by this man who manipulated her mentally, and she got into a very just dark place. And I think it's the same way with, you know, the Gary Ridgways, and it maybe speaks to mental illness as a big factor. And unresolved trauma and whatever, but then we're drawn to it because it's almost like we really love when bad things happen to people. I don't know. It's strange.
Well, I think we're fascinated with it because most of us aren't murderers, thankfully, although we may support certain institutions that do plenty of it, but it's just, I guess, kind of the way the system falls in line. It's also, I think, a byproduct of, and I can understand why we would put, I mean, because even Western theology puts murder at the top of the list of, you know, sins that a person can commit. It's the worst thing that can happen. You take another person's life. But I also think we get into a little bit of dicey territory when we start to say that this act, when committed from one human to another, is worse than this act. You know, when we start grandstanding murder and put it on this pedestal, and then we just say, well, everything else just kind of falls below it. Yeah, but then when they go back and look at these serial killers' childhoods, and in Richard Ramirez's case, they seemingly, without bringing the psychologists in for interpretation and all of that, they seemingly pointed to his childhood as being incredibly disturbing, very, very rife with a lot of incredibly traumatic experiences. Someone murdered right in front of him, tales exchanged about horrible brutality and murder and rape and all kinds of insanity that happened when members of his family were serving in Vietnam that they committed. And this was, you know, you're sitting around talking about this stuff around a 5, 6, 7-year-old kid. And so without saying it directly, the documentary at the very end tended to point to a Richard Ramirez who very well may have been baked differently when he came out of the formative years of him than had he been with a family that was not quite as steeped in cruelty and, really, quite frankly, insanity. I know that's a clinical term that, they don't like you to use, but I don't know what other word you can find for it. Mm-hmm. But again, so then, therefore, if we can make the argument that that is in fact why these things happened, that a 5, 6, 7-year-old child was around these things, saw somebody in his family get shot in the face and killed just right in front of him, and all these other horrible things you can't imagine happening in front of a kid, that is why, again, he turned out to be the Night Stalker, then how can we put any of the crimes that he committed above those things which influenced him to do just that in bulk? See, and that's where I think we also get into a problem with, it was all fun and games when he was skinning cats in the neighborhood, but now that he's stepped up to capital murder on a person, it's a different story. Or, it's bad. I suppose it's one thing you'll hear people say when, this happened to him as a kid, or when he's accosting people on the street, or when he's breaking into homes and sniffing panties, or whatever it is that leads then eventually funnels to this ultimate sin, this murder. Mm-hmm. Well, then this is just where we finally draw the line. See, I have a problem with that too, because I think it speaks to the design of cruelty, the design of being poor to another person, of being cruel to another person, of being, pernicious to another person, I suppose, although that's typically just you're being nasty. But doesn't it all add up? I mean, aren't all of those things in some way, don't they constitute at least the foundations potentially of something that's greater? I mean, we could all be so much kinder to each other and to ourselves in the process. It's really unbelievable. I mean, I catch myself doing it all the time, and it's not, I'm not skinning the neighbor's cat or doing any of those things that I mentioned, certainly, but I'm probably being way too particular with people. I'm probably being way too critical of them. And sometimes I feel like people in the public eye deserve it to make a point, or just because they're sons of bitches and I think they need to be called that. Somebody needs to do it. And so I'm right there to say, hey, but at the same time,
it's kind of like the modern version of flogging, right? So we all learn from somebody else's mistakes. And the thing that I've always wondered, though, and just found ironic or just kind of interesting about that phenomenon is that there's an entertainment factor to it. The podcasts, the true crime genre, I mean, it's an entertainment factor. And that's the thing that I kind of go, okay, that's weird. It's kind of like people who want to consume a certain type of adult video. And I'm just like, yeah, not for me. That's weird, And so then it's, I don't know.
Well, they were showing at least a small portion of the smattering of the naked pictures that Richard Ramirez was receiving from women all over the world. Because again, we're pre-internet days in the mid 80s, obviously. So,
and this is why while he was in prison?
This was after he became incarcerated for murdering, I was 20 people or close to it or over that, 23, something like that. And then I was not aware of the fact that he had committed so many other heinous crimes like child rape and kidnapping. I mean, just all these things. He was just everybody who was around him used that word evil. Again, they said there was an evil presence about him, that there was something that even if there had been a little boy with a soul, little Ricky Ramirez was replaced at some point along the way by this dark abyss that permeated his entire being and allowed him to go and perpetrate these horrible abominations against humanity, these atrocities. So, yeah, there is a Hollywoodizing, I guess, for lack of a better term, that goes on with these things, and it sterilizes the actual humanity that's involved with these crimes. People lose their loved ones, and we've all lost loved ones, but losing somebody, I have an uncle who was murdered, and I can definitely tell you that a couple of teenagers smashed his head in for a rock for like $8.
Yeah.
My uncle was very much like Kramer. I think I've mentioned him on the podcast before. Nobody really knew what he did, but he was not a criminal. He wasn't involved with drugs or anything, but he drove the big Ford LTD, the boat car. and he was just a character. You know, he was a bisexual in the 1970s, for what it's worth, and so his lifestyle was a little bit off the track for the time. You know, it certainly wasn't accepted like it is now. It's gaining acceptance, at least. So, you know, he was the black sheep of my dad's side of the family, the paternal side of my family. And he was known to just hang out with people. You know, he was almost like a vagabond he wasn't really a bum because he had money and he had a car and he had a place to sleep, but he lived a little bit like that. And he ran into the wrong teenagers and they smashed his head in with a rock for like $8. It's all the money he had on him. And of course they got a slap on the wrist and got out in a couple of years because they went to juvie. But I can tell you, having had lost, you know, parents to, you know, my father committed suicide. My mother died of old age. There were others who died of cancer, aunts and uncles and things that I was close enough to. There's nothing quite like losing somebody to murder. It's a different thing to go through for a grieving process. So, you know, you can say that in the wake of all of this, too. It's like we're not lining up the doctor who gave all these 23 people or whatever it amounted to an incorrect diagnosis for cancer that killed a man in 6 months. We're talking about somebody that literally viciously just, you know, destroyed their physical presence here on Earth and, you know, did some unspeakable things to the bodies at that. So, you know, it's troubling. It is troubling to think, like, why would anyone want to have sex with that person and be close to them intimately? But, you know, at the time, welcome to 1985. And now we're 40 years down the road just about, and it's really heated up.
Yeah, and then you add not only the trauma of losing a family member, but then you add that component of celebrity or stardom or whatever it might be to their killer. And it's almost like the family's having to relive it constantly as it's, you know, the trial's going on, and it just kind of turns into a circus. I can't imagine losing a loved one to murder, but I can't imagine what the additional component does to people in their grieving process.
Well, like I said, I've been through that as a child. My uncle was murdered when I was about 9, I guess, in 1982. So, you know, I know what it was like from that perspective as a child. I don't know what it's like because I lost all these other people when I was an adult. So,
and did your parents tell you, like, how old were you again when your uncle died?
9.
So were your parents fairly upfront with you on how he died? And
oh yeah. My father had to go down and ID the body, and even though he was a son of a bitch himself, like, that was one of the hardest things I know he ever had to do, was go and look at his brothers. I mean, it was like JFK, you know, like you've seen the pictures. And isn't it interesting how I've always found that interesting too, speaking of like public sterilization vis-a-vis the position that they held. No way they're going to show you any of those Vics of any of these killers or anybody that, you know, was in war that had half of their head peeled back and their brain exposed. But John F. Kennedy Jr., for whatever reason, no problem. I mean, you watch documentaries about him and the brain is just leaking out all over the place in the morgue. And I just go, why is this? Again, what is it that allows us to be able to say, well, people can handle watching the president's brain pop out of his head after he's had, you know, it's shot off by...
The Zapruder film is probably one of the most watched video segments in America, if not the world, I would argue.
Well, I'm talking about the morgue photos.
Well, that too.
The Zapruder film is also, it's, you know, quite something because you're literally watching someone get shot to death, especially, you know, in the head, a headshot. But I've seen specials on JFK on like regular television before where they show the morgue photos, the autopsy photos, and it's just like, wow, there's no attempt to blur it or anything. It's just right there. And I think it's just because it's JFK's brain, so we can show it. He was the president, so, you know, we're not going to sanitize this. And I question why that is. You also have to know that watching even someone like the president get shot in the head over and over and over and over again on video, is desensitizing to the masses. There's no question about it. I mean, we have been run under with violence. I often chide my girlfriend's parents for the way that they raised her, because it's exactly the opposite of how my mother raised me. In my family, in my household, with me at least, movies where there were boobies and, like nakedness, and no big deal, whatever. Eyes weren't covered. It wasn't, Jack, don't watch this. Jack, leave the room. No problem, because there's no shame in a naked body. And, sex, I suppose, depending on how it was presented, was possibly up for debate. But generally speaking, we were talking about the gratuitous nudity of the 1980s in comedy films and things like that.
PG-13 movies.
Yeah, I mean, Benny Hill stuff. And so my mother was not concerned about that at all. Violence, on the other hand, I mean, I was just reliving how she wouldn't let me watch Starsky and Hutch when I was a boy. And, of course, I was just in awe of the car, because I was into Matchbox cars. And so I just loved the Gran Torino so much. I mean, it was a famous car. Not watching Starsky and Hutch, too violent, what she said. And she did that and it annoyed me as a kid, because she would cover my eyes when she would sit next to me at the theater when she knew there would be violence. I'm thinking of Jaws, when Quint, gets bitten in the midsection and dragged out to sea. Yes. I got my eyes covered for that. I'm thinking about Beverly Hills Cop in the beginning. It is unnecessary because they shoot his friend Mikey in the head with a .22. It's not like these vulgar displays we have now where the bullet goes through the head and there's brain splattering. But it was still enough that she covered my eyes. And, of course, as a kid, I'm just like, oh, knock it off. I want to watch the movie. But I so understand what she was doing years later, which is trying to prevent me from being desensitized to the fact that violence is not a progressive action. And even for the purposes of entertainment, it can affect you if you've been exposed to it enough where you just don't, it doesn't hit you. The fact that you would kill somebody or somebody else would kill somebody, it still may be, well, I would never do that to somebody else, but I'm okay watching it or knowing that it happens. We don't want a world like that.
I wonder if Ken Burns would ever do a serial killer documentary, like a true crime Dateline style documentary. And it would have the Peter Coyote narration, of course. And it would sound something like, Ricardo Leva Muñez Ramirez, better known as Richard Ramirez, was an American serial killer and sex offender whose killing spree occurred in the greater Los Angeles and the San Francisco Bay Area. And they're like panning across this black and white image, or they cut to one of the scenes of the victim, and then they just keep spreading out further and further, and there's more blood.
I feel like we're in a serial killer version of Oh Brother, Where Art Thou? I think Ken Burns is a little pastoral for that kind of material. I always loved the Simpsons gag on him where they said it was part 2 of a 17-part series about the history of electric football. the game on the metal board where you turn it on and the players would just vibrate and fall down. I had that when I was a kid. And so hand-me-downs from my brother. And how much time do you want to give to those things? I was thinking, too, about comedians from the 1980s, too. We talk about, George Carlin. I always mention, one of my favorites, Bill Hicks. And I'm not aware of any material that either of them ever did about serial killers. And I think it maybe was because they didn't want to give those types of people a lot of, public approbation. They didn't want to come out and exalt those people for what they did by making jokes, although I can see both of those comedians actually doing that because they were pretty far removed from having a filter for a reason. But anyway,
you're right. I don't ever remember that. Oh, okay. So no, it says George Carlin tips for serial killers.
Yeah, and I'm not surprised that he got to that. The only thing that I'm remembering is when he, in one of his stand-up routines, said, I was reading the other day about how some guy broke into an 80-year-old woman's house and robbed and raped her. And I'm thinking, why? What kind of a social life does this guy have? And So, and it's a very fair question, what kind of a social life does a person have who would commit such an act like that? But I think it goes beyond being out of social touch. I think that's what we're fascinated with, quite honestly, when it comes to those things. And I don't think we mean to spend our quality time here reliving vicariously all of these horrible acts through documentaries and through survivors who tell the stories and through the survivors of victims who tell the stories. I think we're just fascinated because we really can't put our finger on why someone would. It's so far removed from the norm. One murder that's done in the heat of passion is almost understandable to everybody because we've all
like
probably
the O.J. Simpson being his previous character was nowhere near what somebody would have thought would have committed something like that.
Yeah, we've all been in the heat of passion for one reason or another, and we all have been, kind of a loose cannon at some point because we're too emotional, and that's how a lot of homicides get committed is emotions run too high and they boil over. But the predatory angle, the lure of committing violence and cruelty over and over and over again. And I mean, especially, Richard Ramirez didn't waste any time. We're talking about he had 2 victims, 3 victims in the same night sometimes. Whereas, the Bundys and Gacy's were stretching theirs out, I guess, to the tune of weeks, if at the shortest. I guess, I don't know that much about it, but I think that's the allure. I think the allure is it's so far removed from the dynamic that we would apply normality to, that we would say, well, this is normal behavior, that we're just drawn to it, that we can't help but continue asking the question why. And I don't think we're ever going to get an answer. Psychologists have still never come up with an answer except for, again, in the case of Ramirez at least, is it the lashing out? Is it the final act of a life that to that point had been fraught with so much cruelty of its own that he then became the perpetrator instead of the victim? I don't know, but it's all just awful. And like I said, I don't want too much of it in my brain, but I am still interested in it. It's not like I won't watch a documentary on that. I would rather watch a documentary about that than I would watch a football game on TV, quite honestly, because at least I'm learning something about historical events. I'm possibly, I'm learning about the men in this case with the Night Stalker who put him away, who tracked him, and their families and what they went through, because it was hell on those guys too. Learned about a lot of the interplay between the media in the 1980s in a big city like LA and the law enforcement community and politics. So there was a lot there. And so it wasn't just all of this glorified serial killer stuff. There was a lot there. And I, instead of just the repetitive nature of carrying a ball back and forth or putting it in a hole, I hate to, denigrate sports, but again, I think in the public eye, we're way too invested in that stuff. And we gotta get our act together there. That stuff's gotta go.
Well, something that you planted in my brain, and I actually followed up with it. Last episode, we were talking about the movie Communion with Christopher Walken. And, oh, man, what an interesting movie. It was one of those movies where it's like, I can't believe I have never watched this movie. And
here I am, I'm naked. I'm naked. I'm talking to you like you were real. Go to hell.
Here it comes. It's coming out of the wall. Looks like one of those vacuums at the
Can we talk this over?
car wash.
Yeah, it looks like you're going to sing White Christmas.
So was that the first movie where they ever introduced this idea of aliens probing humans?
To my knowledge, yes. And it could have been some kind of a passing gag in another movie, but certainly that the whole movie centered around that
premise.
Yeah, it absolutely, as far as I'm aware of. Maybe there's an underground filmmaker that pulled one off a few years prior. But Communion, of course, is the story. It's supposed to tell the story of Whitley Strieber. And I don't recall how Whitley reacted to the movie. I think he was okay with some of it and not so okay with other parts of it. And that's very true to form for all Hollywood adaptations when you go back to the original person. Like, there are also those that are absolutely just total fucking fiction. Rudy comes to mind. I interviewed that guy when I was in sports radio years ago. Okay. And no offense, again, with all deference to that guy, Rudy Rudiger, whatever his name was, he's a total milk dud. The dude is about as interesting as a Triscuit with nothing on it. I mean, and yet he's a motivational speaker, and he will literally come out. And one thing, I'll give him credit for this. He will come out and literally tell you the whole movie is a bogus affair. None of that happened the way that it was presented. None of it. Especially the stuff that happened at Notre Dame. And especially the stuff that happened at the end of the movie where he's put in and he takes down the Georgia Tech quarterback. And, yeah, none of that happened. Not even close.
Well, it's based on a true story. It doesn't mean that it all happened, but it's loosely based on a true story. There's based, there's loosely based, and then there's, hey, you know, we just made it
about
up.
A guy playing football. Hey, we happen to have a midget who played football for us too, but and none of this ever happened. I mean, there's a total disconnect there. So to his credit, he's very honest about, look, the movie, not on point at all. They more than stretched the truth. They literally just wrote their own movie and then plugged my name onto it. So, but I think true to form for a lot of movies that are supposed to, again, be based on something, especially by name, because Whitley Strieber literally lets them use his name in the film. Too.
Right.
It's probably good for book sales at the time. And he was also wanting to get the story promulgated as much as possible. I think that's about the same that I've heard from a lot of people. Yes, I like part of what they did with my story. No, it's like Stephen King film adaptation. Stephen King was typically happy with about half of what most of the directors and producers did and didn't like the other half. Unless it was, there were a couple that he absolutely hated, and then there were a couple that he felt like they really did a pretty good job with. I'm not remembering which is which. But, yeah, so that movie, it's the first to my knowledge that went into that subject and really probed, pun fully intended, what the phenomenon was about. And remember, you're talking about a lot of experiencers at the time that walked by that book. You know, that book comes out 2 years before the movie is made, and people were terrified of that image because so many of them had said, this is exactly what I saw. Or they actually they'd repressed the memories, and that image brought it right back. I mean, so the cover of that book has often been said is one of the most brilliant book covers in history because it literally caused flashbacks of these traumatic experiences for people because it has that, we call it a gray alien. But in the movie, and much like in Whitley, I think in his experiences, he did describe it as a suit. It was not actually what the thing looked like. And we were talking last time on the pod, too, I know, about those little guys.
Yeah,
and
the trolls,
near-death experiencers have seen those little guys and say those are the exact same little guys that I saw in my NDE, not an abduction experience. So, yeah, but this from just a pure Siskel and Ebert standpoint, love Christopher Walken. He overdid Whitley Strieber in that movie. I mean, his performances are oft comical because he's Christopher Walken and he's just funny portraying anything, but in that movie, it's especially campy.
Can we talk this over? Yeah, it looks like we're going to sing White Christmas.
Can we talk this over?
Hey, you!
Look at me. I'm naked.
I'm not sure who else they would have picked, but...
Yeah, I don't think they could have picked a better person than Christopher Walken, but there are so many one-liners in that movie that are just so classic Walken, and well, yeah, it was worth a view though. But I'm surprised that I hadn't seen that movie before.
Now, since we're talking about movies about alien abduction, and we have Communion on the table, which again is would the peg fit the round hole? Is it small enough in some ways to actually sort of fit? Yes. Again, I think they did a fair enough job of relaying Whitley's experiences. I haven't read Communion in years. It was a long time ago, so I'm not remembering what his experiences were, but it seemed to me like they were fairly parallel with the movie, although the movie did take some liberties, because you just expect that. It's a Hollywood movie. They got to sell tickets. On the other hand, Fire in the Sky, which profiles the Travis Walton experience, is absolutely a demonic interpretation of what his real-life experience was. And the producers of that movie should be ashamed of themselves for ever having been allowed to portray things in that way, because they were gotten to, is the story. The story is that, because Travis's story is that he's zapped by this craft. Mm-hmm. He's essentially dead or dying because of coming into contact with this energy that, knocks out his physical faculties enough that he's in trouble, on life support. These beings take him into the craft, zoom up into space, patch him up because they have the ability to do that, and then proceed to give him the grand tour of the ship, show him the Earth from up above it, things that are very similar with a lot of other experiencers, and if you want to use the word abductees, although in the 50s and 40s, it was the space friends who would come and offer you a ride. And then as soon as Betty and Barney Hill happened, then all of a sudden we're being taken against our will. What happened there? A lot of guesses. We don't have time for that. But Travis Walton's experience was not this horrific, thing that happened to him that they show in the movie Fire in the Sky with these little squinty-eyed, dull, those things are just they're creepier than Greys even, you'd have to think. And then they're putting this like silly putty in his mouth and it's shutting him up, and then they're injecting this thing into his eye and he's screaming in terror, and none of that happened. Travis absolutely, as flat out said, it's absolutely wrong. And the story goes that they were going to tell the real story of what happened to Travis Walton, but you can play either the conspiracy theory card or just the Hollywood producer card, which is somehow they got to the script and said, no, we need it to be sensational. We need it to be terrifying. And, of course, a lot of the people that believe that the government is trying to rally us around a cause against our space friends would say, yeah, they were gotten to by the dark factions that want us to feel like aliens are nefarious, that extraterrestrials are bad, and that we should fear them because they want to create a culture of fear. And that movie does a very good job of it because that scene is quite unsettling. Or maybe it's just a Hollywood producer that says, hey, baby, this doesn't have enough panache to sell tickets. Let's get some silly putty in his mouth. Let's get some screaming and something going up his butt or his eyeball. Let's go, baby. Either way, does it really matter? Like, it's just as evil both ways, theoretically. Who sent you?
Yeah, exactly. And, if it is some kind of a conspiracy to pit us against them, that's what they want, right? Because you can't have society start siding with the aliens. I mean, who are these guys? These new kids on the block. They show up, and now all of a sudden, you guys want to institute some new form of government?
You stole one of my favorite lines from the movie Major League. Who are these fucking guys? Well, I don't know what they're up to, but all I know is that just stay as free of mind as possible. Just try to think, try to create yourself, whatever you envision that to be, and try to think with whatever self that is that you've envisioned. And if it falls in line with what they're telling you, okay, well, I guess it falls in line with what they're telling you. I can't help but side with the extraterrestrials because why not? I mean, being human is a magical, wonderful, mystical experience that we've pretty well fucked up in a lot of ways that we shouldn't have. And it's not to say that it can't still be and that it isn't every day. I mean, for as rotten and terrible as I may make it sound, I really am like a fan of existence. It's a miracle, but it's frustrating to watch what we do with it, I think. And we've keyed in on some of the basic topics, I think, today about why that is. The glorification of violence and the proliferation of fear for the sake of ulterior motivations. And, because really it sounds to me, and this would be a really good guess, honestly, because I was just told a story by, I'll call him an extended family member, even though my girlfriend and I aren't married yet, but it's her uncle. And her uncle is an experiencer. There's no question about it. He has seen these things. He can contact these things, so I've been told, and can make them appear in the space around his yard in a rural part of the United States where he lives that I'll not mention to kind of quasi-protect his privacy here. But he saw something in our neck of the woods not too far up to the north some years ago when he was living there. And it was a craft, not unlike a lot of craft that are seen, but it was emerging from the side of a mountain. And then there were, a couple of really dark F-16 fighter jets flying right over the area within minutes. He was convinced to intercept this craft, which had already left the atmosphere. He said it went straight up and disappeared. So they were scrambled, as they, I guess, say in Air Force terms, to investigate this, or, I don't know what they're doing up there. But the summer after this happened, apparently there was an Air Force pilot that came through the grocery store where he worked. And how he was able to know this, I don't know. But he knew it. Maybe he recognized him or something like that. But he just said that he knew him to be an Air Force pilot. Maybe he was wearing his uniform or something. And so he asked him as he was taking his groceries out to his car with him, he said, what about these things? I saw this thing, and then you guys came and you chased it, basically. You were looking for it. And, he's just like, I know you probably can't say anything, but what gives? What the hell? I mean, what are we dealing with here? I'm fascinated by this stuff. I want some answers. And the guy didn't invoke his, presidential gag order to the point where you might think that he would.
His clearance.
He just said, he kind of put his top double secret probation, top secret clearance, Dean Wormer clearance aside and said, well, I can't say everything, obviously, that I know, but he said, I can say this. We don't know a lot, and we're still trying to figure out what these things are and what we're dealing with.
Interesting.
And I'm not sure that I don't buy that, quite honestly, because
100%.
Well, and that's kind of what they're telling us now, and that's what troubles me, because I don't want to believe a word they're telling us ever.
Absolutely.
When you look at it, it almost kind of makes sense, because what is a government to do that has it's so obviously technologically overmatched by the things that are showing up in its skies, especially in the 50s. They're over the Capitol. They're over the Capitol building with a force. There's lights everywhere. What does a government do if it really wants to save face and keep its people, again, in control and not out of control? It tells them that it has no idea what these things are and they're not real, that there's no evidence to suggest that they exist. So it's the boogeyman.
Absolutely.
Or it tells them eventually, all right, do we tell them we're kind of trying to figure out what these things are still? To me, that's almost the worst thing you could do, because that suggests, holy shit, we don't know what these things are. We don't know what
they are. Yeah, and I think the truth is somewhere in between, right? And it's interesting because one of the things that I did not too long ago, I was following a man on YouTube who is active military. He's a fighter pilot, and he takes some kind of a GoPro up with him so that you can see what he sees. And you can see his...
I'm surprised he's allowed to do that.
That's
and then
what I thought, too.
Yeah, I would think that would all be absolutely no-no.
No, my luck, he'll get
I'm not buying that.
He'll get shut down, but...
I don't buy that for a second.
So I'll send you the link. But it's interesting because I texted him, or I messaged him. And there's all these comments, yeah, go USA, whatever. And one of the things I said to him was, yeah, it's interesting, your coworkers and you will go through this community up to the north from us often. And I remember seeing you guys I was playing golf up there. you and your coworkers. And he got back to me and he said, yep, that was us. And I said, so, did you guys see any aliens today? I just flat out said it to him. And his response was, not today.
Well, that could have just been to shoo you off, or it could have just been the truth. Not today, but sometimes we see them.
Well, and I think it's more the latter, because there are many people that have not only been in the cockpit for hours on end, but I think that these things have been going on for a long time. And like you said, it was stigmatized to a point where it was like, well, don't believe what you just saw because it doesn't exist. And if you do believe what you just saw because it doesn't exist, then your career is over as a pilot. So would you rather put that away and all of the work that you've done? And so there's a threat, essentially, that's made. And I think it's interesting that all of these things with UAPs are coming back out again. And there's this phenomenon, we talked about the serial killer phenomenon, but I do think that there's this UFO phenomenon, and there's these things that are starting to come out in the media. And Good Morning America had Bob Lazar was on Good Morning America.
Oh, yeah.
I mean,
that's interesting. 20
years ago, would you have said that anyone from that category would have been pushing their book on Good Morning America? No, you wouldn't.
No, Bob Lazar was heavily scrutinized by a couple of ufologists that are pretty well known. I can't remember the one fella's name off the top of my head, but he hated Bob Lazar. I mean, I don't think he hated him as a man, but I think he thought he was a crackpot from the beginning, that he was. But see, that's the problem, is no one is ever going to be able to just come forward and say, I worked here, I saw this, I saw that, and get everybody's approval. It's just
true.
It's just not possible. And then the biggest problem is on the back end of that, when the government finally steps forward and says, okay, this is what this is, and this is what we know about it. I'm not going to believe that either.
We're going to believe what we want to believe.
I don't believe a word they say.
Right.
So we're in a pickle because of the mendacity that has been fashioned around not only this subject, but all subjects related to the U.S. government and our leaders. I was just talking about this with a coworker earlier today, whom I know you're acquainted with. We were talking about the whole $400 hammer thing, and now that's probably like a joke. Now they probably charge the U.S. government, a couple thousand for a single hammer. But he was talking about why wasn't there any oversight of these contractors that were going hog wild and charging the government. It's like the $75 aspirin when you're in the hospital, right, that sort of thing. And he's just like, he's blaming a lack of oversight. And I just told him, I said, it's not a lack of oversight. I said, it's a bribe or a kickback to make that oversight disappear. Because even if you are a federal regulator and you audit these companies for the federal government for a living, the most you're probably making, and I don't honestly know, but do you make $250,000 a year? That's a damn fine living. In most places you live, only in San Francisco would that be a pauper salary, or maybe New York trying to get by. That's still a decent chunk of money. But when someone comes forward and says, hey, that audit that we got coming up next week, how does $10 million sound in a Cayman Islands bank account today, tax-free with your name on it? The audit's good. What do we say? That's what these people do.
Yeah.
And the problem is that money, when it's stacked up high enough, can buy integrity. We see it every single day, over and over and over again. And so that's where we're down to. We're down to people have sold their souls because there's no integrity. There's no fibrous integrity left in a shred of the U.S. government, as far as I'm concerned.
Exactly.
Anyway.
And it kind of reminds me of the relationship that Boeing had with the FAA and the kind of like the self-inspection that Boeing was doing, or they were being inspected by the FAA. But to me, it's like, okay, yeah, terrible that Boeing was potentially cutting corners to make more money. And in the end, ironically, it ends up hurting them more financially because of the corners that they cut. However, where was the oversight by the FAA, who is a government agency who's supposed to be in a position, no matter what, to sniff these things out and essentially say no. And so they're trying to blame it on Boeing, and then Boeing, and then it comes out that the FAA was involved in this like what you're saying, make it all go away. It's ridiculous.
Well, and that's the problem with, and I know a lot of people say it's not capitalism, Jack. That's the problem. You bash capitalism all the time. Capitalism isn't the problem. It's the fact that any government would rely on the integrity of human beings. It's just the natural breakdown is in the integrity of human beings. Who pays for drug trials? Now, you ask that question to anybody on the street, walk around today, find intelligent enough people, if you can, not just, food and drug, what? Drugs, where? Are they free? No. Who pays for the FDA to do double-blind testing on new medications, on any medications? Who does the testing? And people would say, well, the FDA does. You're correct, but who pays for the testing?
It's the pharmaceutical company.
The pharmaceutical companies pay for it because the federal government doesn't have enough money.
R&D, right?
So there you go. So R&D from all of the giant corporations that outweigh the U.S. government's massive money by trillions, they step forward and they fund their own drug trials, basically. They hire out to have someone in the government do their own drug trials. Now, you tell me if that's not an equation that's waiting to break down almost overnight.
Well, and then people complain about the healthcare costs or the medication costs associated with said drug. And, I strongly believe that nobody ever wakes up in the morning and says, today, I'm going to get sick. I want to get sick today. I want to get so sick that it ruins my life. I want to get sick today. Nobody does that, right? And so it is the cumulative cost of the research and development. It is the, and rightfully so, the pharmaceutical companies are saying, okay, which one are we going to go after next? Well, we're not going to go after this one that affects this person. We're not going to go after, this one because there's no money in it. And so, heaven forbid we would come up with a drug that would help people with their, alcoholism or their, mental, their issues there. But no, we're going to go after cancer, or we're going to go after this. And because people with money get cancer and then they can pay for it and they can afford it.
Well, Howard Hughes might be the only man, by the way, that would actually get up in the morning and say, I want to get sick today because he was so intrigued with it for so long. That would be my argument, though, that the actual, and to me, here's the thing. I'm not bashing, while I'm bashing capitalism, I'm not taking shots at any other form of government. There is no perfect form of government. I'm telling you, I'm into Smurfism. The Smurfs had it down. They knew how to run a village. The problem is there's so many of us trying to run the village. But the fundamental breakdown in capitalism really isn't about the fact that people will lose their integrity. It's about the fact that even by the standards, even if everybody is integral in that entire process, the son of a bitch that's sitting on the top floor of the pharmaceutical company will have more money than 99.9% of everybody else in the world by a long shot. That is not right. I'm sorry. I'm an egalitarian to the core in some ways, and that is not acceptable. It's not okay. Call me a communist, which I have been many times over, if you want to. To me, communism is not rooted in everybody living in the same kind of house. You've been to the suburbs lately? Have you seen the projects in South Chicago? I have. Have you seen the suburbs in Midwestern towns or in San Francisco? Jesus, drive south of San Francisco. I don't remember what the neighborhood's called. They go on and on and on forever, and they're exactly the same, and it is upsetting to your mind. The homes are so stamped out, they're so Spartan, and they're so pedestrian that it just it starts to hurt your brain. You're dying for anything to happen that might be a rainbow or a butterfly that would fly in front of the car window as you're looking at this shit. So, you can't. You can't just say that everybody having the same thing is just communism and then nobody can get ahead in life. When we're allowed to get ahead in life to the point where it's egregious. it's unnecessary. And to me, that's the component that has to die in human beings long before we worry about their integrity collapsing, quite honestly. I mean, this drive to be our own little king has got to end because it's doing us no good whatsoever. It's driving us into oblivion is where it's driving us. I mean, look at the separation of the haves and have-nots. They said the middle class would disappear. You know, when I was a kid, they said, oh, the middle class will evaporate by the time you're, I mean, the class system, there really is no class system anymore. It's just a fucking free-for-all. You know, I mean, and there are people out there who work, if you want to just quantify it, because that's what everybody usually tries to put back in my face. I was, you know, the last time I was called a communist was by this woman who worked for the Fish and Wildlife Service, and they shared an office with where I was working for this small media company up on the upper floor of this building. And we got into this discussion one way, shape, or form one day, and she was just like, you're a communist. And I said, no, I'm an egalitarian who believes that we should be free to a point when it comes to the riches that we can accrue, because we have to understand the value of giving back to the world. We have to understand the value of giving back to each other rather than to ourselves. And isn't a ride that everybody can ride is worth building a lot more than a ride that can only be ridden by the very rich few. The world would disagree with me, I know, by and large, but that's the way that I see it. It's the only way out of this mess. We're going to have to get over that. And the big thing that she lauded to me in her sort of red, white, and blue rant against
her assault,
was she was so proud of the degree that she had on her wall. And she had some kind of master's from someplace. You know, I'm sure she worked hard for it, but it was the whole, I worked hard, I went to school, I did all this, I worked, and now I have this piece of paper. And so therefore I'm privileged. I'm afforded the luxury of making twice as much as you, 3 times as much as that guy, 10 times as much as the person at Arby's, although I don't think she made that much. But that to me, to me, that's the fundamental problem, is that mentality right there, that I just outworked you in some theoretical fashion, and so therefore I deserve more than you. And it's the same thing that, I mean, I did this on the radio years ago when I was interviewing the Chamber of Commerce, and the woman who headed the Chamber of Commerce, nice lady, we were talking, and she was discussing wages and trying to bring wages up in the community, and fast food workers came up and this sort of thing. And I said, having written a piece just recently about it on my own terms, I said, well, do you happen to know what the CEO of Yum Brands, which is KFC, A&W, they got a couple others under their large umbrella. I don't have the figures in front of me. They're written down somewhere, and this is years ago, so it's probably even worse now. But, you know, the man made like just an outrageous amount of money, more than most of the people, than all the people on the front lines who are running the restaurants and actually making and selling and distributing the products. I mean, and I don't know what he does to earn so much more, but my suggestion to the Chamber of Commerce was we need to cap how much money a person can make. We need to cap what CEOs are allowed to make. We have to set a maximum threshold per, you know, like U.S. law standards has to say you can only make this much if you work for a company. You cap out right here, because otherwise it will get egregiously unfair. And she looked at me in awe. It was almost as though I had just said that Mickey Mouse was in the room and was ready to sit down and talk to all of us, or that, you know, Betty Grable was back from the dead and the zombie Betty Grable was about to sit down and start talking on the mic and her jaw was going to fall off. And, you know, I mean, she was flabbergasted, astounded with the notion that I would suggest such a thing, capping salaries in a company. And she said, well, probably better for us to just really get training into the hands of those people that work on the front lines, and, you know, like, so that they can go to school and have an opportunity to go and be the CEO themselves. And I'm like, no, you're not getting the fucking point. Like, you're about as far off track as you could get. No,
she wants to take the can and give it to somebody else.
Listen, it's a simple equation. Okay. Let's say it's a small kingdom. Okay. Let's say that this Kentucky Fried Chicken kingdom is a small one, and there are 50,000 residents there. Okay. Well, we want to empower 49,999 residents to learn how to be the king. But guess what? There's only one king. So you tell me how that's going to work out in the end for 49,999 people who ain't the king. It isn't going to work out for them. And it's the same equation in corporate America and with the corporate structure. It's the same thing. It's not going to work out for them because you can go and train those frontline employees as much as you want and give them the college fund and send them here and let them climb this golden ladder. How many of them are going to fall or not even come close to the top tier before they even, I mean, the notion is ridiculous. That notion is ridiculous. And for us to hide behind the veil of, well, we're educating them, so why they're not CEO is not our fault. Come on. I mean, the problem is that there's a king in the first place to become.
Well, and I think that also a lot of people don't realize that nonprofit executives don't have something that corporate executives do have built into their salaries. And not all of them, but many of the corporate executives, their compensation is based on stock.
Profits, stocks. Yeah.
Stock. So the more money their stock makes, the more money they make, and everybody falls in line. Those who print the money get to make all the rules.
Oh, yeah. It's an age-old rant, and it all goes back to it's not fair, but it's not fair, and it wasn't designed to be fair. And I have no idea what the Founding Fathers had in mind when they created all this. Maybe it was really a great idea, and we have just fucked it up, and they weren't so much to blame. But I don't know. To me, just that's another little soapbox of mine, though, that gets brought out quite often, is we have to stop the search for being our own little king. The idea, the American dream, to me, even though the whole notion sucks. I mean, I don't want to follow the American dream for anything. But if there is such a thing as the American dream, it used to be, and I think we've talked about this, come up with something that you can serve your fellow people with. I don't care. I was just watching this thing about Orville Redenbacher today. He's a birthday twin of mine. So whether it's popping corn that kicks ass or whether it's, making jujubes or F-16 fighter jets or whatever the case is, just do it and do it well and then hand it down to your sons and daughters for them to run for the next generation. But now the model of the American dream is start something with any idea you can and with anybody's money that you can, borrowed or otherwise, build it up to a point where it's worth just so much, sell it off for more than it's worth, and retire to a private island and never fucking look back at the rest of the world. That's the new American dream.
Yeah, that's a bleeping dead alien body if I ever bleeping saw one.
I love it. You share a birthday with Orville Redenbacher, and I share a birthday with Wayne Newton. What does that say about us?
Wayne Newton? Really? I never knew that.
Dankeschön.
Oh, man. I'm proud to have Orville in my corner, quite honestly.
As you should. As you should. What are we listening to today?
Oh, this is my boy from Canada's Rob Moratti. The truth is out there.
Well, the truth is out there. We just don't know where to find it now, do we?
Oh, we can find it here on this program.
There we go. Until we meet again, Jack Hansen.
Sounds good, man. I'm going to go duck for cover.
But it's out there somewhere, waiting to be found. You keep looking for that one shining moment in time.
Well, it looks like Jack and Michael have finished up their latest chat about all things existence. But if anything they said got your own Existence Brewing, be sure and catch their other talks at existencebrewing.com and drop them an email to share your thoughts using contact@existencebrewing.com.
Existence Brewing.